day, and welcome to the second episode of the Global Goals Webinar series. My name is Caroline Sennett, and I have the great honor to chair and moderate this session today, which is dedicated to global governance and the Sustainable Development Goals. So the Global Goals Webinar series is a joint endeavor of the Global Goals Project conducted at Utrecht University and the SDG Task Force of the Earth System Governance Project, which is the largest research network on the politics and governance of Earth system transformations. In this webinar series, we present the findings of the SDG Midterm Impact Assessment, which is forthcoming with Cambridge University Press in early 2022, and which is coordinated by Frank Bierman, Thomas Hickman, and myself, and that also involves more than 60 authors from all around the world. And in this edited volume, our central question is whether the SDGs have become a transformative force in governance, and we'll look for evidence of changes in institutions, organizations, policies, and discourses consequently to the adoption of the SDGs. And we specifically focus on 6 key areas, each associated to one chapter in the volume. So we look at the global governance of sustainable development with a focus on the UN system, and this is the topic of the webinar today. We'll look at the implementation of the SDGs at multiple levels, including current knowledge and factors that explain progress, as well as barriers in implementation. We'll look at the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals at at interlinkages between the SDGs and institutional integration, as well as policy coherence in implementation. We look also at inclusiveness of global and local governance arrangements to achieve the SDGs. We look at whether the SDGs have strengthened ecological integrity at planetary level. And finally, we also explore existing knowledge on assessment and indicators. So for each of these areas, the lead authors of the chapters have conducted a comprehensive assessment of the academic literature based on a targeted keyword search with Scopus, and the insights from this qualitative content analysis of the academic literature were then complemented by key findings from gray literature. And so today we will discuss the extent to which the SDGs have led to political and institutional changes in the global governance of sustainable development, specifically within the United Nations system. And 3 distinguished panelists are joining us this afternoon to explore this question. So first, I'm extremely happy to welcome the lead authors of the second chapter of the SDG Midterm Impact Assessment, Marianne Beisheim and Steven Bernstein. Marianne Beisheim is a senior researcher in the research division Global Issues at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. Marianne is a renowned expert in global governance for sustainable development, both on the negotiations and institutions at the United Nations, and also on voluntary initiatives by civil society, business, and also multi-stakeholder partnerships. Welcome, Marianne. Steven Bernstein is Distinguished Professor of Global Environmental and Sustainability Governance in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto in Canada. And he's also co-director of the Environmental Governance Lab at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, also at the University of Toronto. Steven has extensively researched and published on global governance and institutions, global environmental politics, non-state form of governance, and he currently focuses on coherence and incoherence in global sustainability governance. Welcome, Steven. So Marianne and Steven will provide teaser insights into the work of their wonderful author team on whether the literature identified any major changes in global governance following the adoption of the SDGs. Then Javier Surasky will reflect on these findings and set them into the broader context of his experience in working on and studying the SDGs from a Global South perspective. Javier is the coordinator of the Governance for Development unit at Cepei, which is in Spanish the Centro de Pensamiento Estratégico Internacional. Cepei is a think tank which is based in Bogota, Colombia, that promotes multi-stakeholder participation in global agendas on sustainable development. Javier is also professor of public international law at the National University La Plata in Argentina, and he has acquired extensive expertise from his consultancy work in different international organizations, governments, and civil society organizations. Welcome, Javier. It's great to have you. But before we hand over to our panelists, here are some notes on housekeeping, although I'm sure that you are all Zoom experts by now. So only panelists and moderators' videos and audios are available. Q&A in chat is, on the other hand, open to all. The panel will address the audience questions after the speaker's presentation. To ask a question, please use the Q&A button on the lower section of your screen. And if you wish to direct your question at a certain speaker, just write the name and then the question. And there's also the possibility, if you like someone else's question, to vote that question so that it appears at the top of the list. And now, without further ado, I'm extremely happy to give the floor to Marianne and Stephen.
Thank you very much, Carol Ann and the Utrecht team, for the wonderful introduction, for the opportunity to speak here today. I'm trying to share our presentation now. Okay. Here we go. Give me a second so I can also see you. All right, so assessing the SDGs impact on global governance. This is what I will speak about today. This is chapter 2 of the book that Carol Ann introduced to you just now. And Stephen and I will share this task of presenting you with the teaser insights that Carol Ann promised. But in fact, this is a joint effort of a whole group of co-authors, and I listed them for you. Frank Biermann is involved, so is Pam Chasik, Melanie van Driel, Felicitas Fritsche, Carol Ann Sennett herself, and also Silke Weinlich are all part of the authors team, and most of them are with us today and will help us answer your questions later. So how did we translate the framework of the book into our own framework when assessing what the literature tells us about the SDGs' impact on global governance? First of all, we had to realize that the early literature, say the literature between 2014 and 2016-17, does not, of course, obviously speak a lot about the actual impact of the SDGs on global governance, but speaks more about expectations. So, you know, explains what the SDGs are, what is the context in the various fields, and then tells us what the experts would expect to happen. Also, of course, we thought the obvious starting point is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development itself, to look at what the SDGs in this context of the 2030 Agenda, because the 2030 Agenda has 4 parts. It has a political declaration, then the goals, then there's the section of means of implementation, and last but not least, the section of follow-up and review. And this is another starting point to look at the aspirations of the 2030 and the SDGs all together. And so we settled for 4 types of aspirations and expectations. The 4 are given on the slide. It is that the SDGs will enhance and improve the multilateral leadership and guidance, so not only multilateral cooperation, but really leadership and guidance in the global governance system, that they will help enhance system-wide coherence and policy coordination. 3 is that they will build on the global partnership that has already been introduced with the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, and help raise further means of implementation. And also part number 4 is the global level follow-up and review. It would generate new data, leaving no one behind, enhance peer learning among member states, how to implement the SDGs, and also help with accountability towards citizens. Now, of course, we then look mainly for literature discussing how the SDGs actually led to those changes that the introductory chapter of the book asks for, and that is discursive changes, institutional or organizational changes, and normative changes, in our case, in global governance. And we decided to focus on the United Nations because global governance is huge, right? So our focus is really on the United Nations. And we decided to further focus on 3 areas. Number 1 is global sustainable development governance itself. And here we look at the UN High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, in short, HLPF. Then the second one is global developmental governance. We focus on what the United Nations development system changed in following the SDGs introduction. And last but not least, global environmental governance. What does the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, and the new United Nations Environmental Assembly do with regard to the SDGs? This provides us with a framework. So the book asks us to look at discursive changes and the other type of changes. We do that with regard to these 4 starting points or expectations that we see in the literature, and focus on these 3 types of institutions. And when we speak of steering effects, we really focus on authoritative, purposeful steering, intentional steering. And the book wants us to find literature that specifically discusses causal pathways, which is of course really difficult, but we were supposed to look for this kind of literature. And this is what we did. We analyzed the literature. So we didn't do any, just to manage some expectations here, any new empirical analysis, but really just evaluated the literature. And as Carol Ann already mentioned, we used the Scopus search for this, for the peer-reviewed literature, and then added through a snowball approach also gray literature, drawing also on our own expertise and work that we do in the area. And this provided us with some immediate conclusions, and that is that the number of studies about actual steering effects was very limited. So in the academic literature, there's not much out there, and what is out there is often assessments that are largely observational, that look at single cases, policies, sectors, countries, and there's little detailed analysis of empirical outcomes, let alone impact or causal analysis, how the SDGs really stepwise led to this kind of impact. And we would say, well, maybe there are many studies underway that are not yet published. If not, well, there is room for future research. So let me present you some findings with regard to the Global Sustainable Development Governance, that is the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. I switched a bit the order because first I would like to talk about the follow-up and review. Really, the mandate of the HLPF is to oversee follow-up and review processes throughout the United Nations on the implementation of the SDGs. And the language of the 2030 agenda has all these wonderful words in it to describe these processes. They shall be robust, voluntary, effective, participatory, and transparent. And this, of course, raised many expectations also in the literature. The literature suggested that these reviews need to build on existing reviews. They would generate the new data, strengthen the accountability. But of course, already back then in the early literature, you could also find analysis that there is resistance among member states to install prescriptive review. So member states were also a bit reluctant to have finger pointing and all this. So when we now evaluate the actual steering effects in terms of follow-up and review, we find that the literature says there's very good participation in these reviews, which is a big success, celebrated as a big success, actually. We had so far 249 presentations of voluntary national reviews at the United Nations HLPF, which is really a very good number. Unfortunately, after the presentations, the exchange among member states is not very interactive and there's not much follow-up. So all in all, the expectations that this is a rather soft peer learning mechanism is also, you can find this as a de facto analysis in the literature. It's a lot about individual learning, not so much steering. As for the multilateral leadership, what you would then expect is that building on this follow-up and review, there's an outcome document of the HLPF that builds on all these insights from these review processes and then guides, directs, steers the further implementation of the SDGs. But in fact, although the mandate that was already given in 2013 says political leadership guidance and recommendation is what the HLPF is supposed to do, albeit not too prescriptive, and the wording is rather ambiguous. The formal steering, the literature says the formal steering is very limited. The outcome document, which is a ministerial declaration, is actually pre-negotiated before the forum actually meets. And because of the highly politicized negotiations in New York and the overall lack of political will in the crisis of multilateralism, all this, the outcome, the official formal outcome document is rather weak. So the expectations in the literature that this will not be the apex body that some had hoped for confirmed. It's rather a weak body under the auspices of ECOSOC. And the music is not so much in what happens formally, but more informally. And we'll come back to this. Stephen will speak a bit, I guess, later on how the HLPF orchestrates, or rather not, or what it could do more. But it's definitely also not an empty institution. Some of the literature was saying it could be another empty institution. I think this is too strong. As for coherence, the HLPF's mandate was to enhance the integration of the 3 dimensions of sustainable development in a holistic and cross-sectoral manner. And the expectations in the literature were actually very strong in that direction, that this would promote coherence, as the SDGs are designed in this way to talk about interlinkages. And there was hope that the high-level political forum would give high-level input for what the UN ECOSOC's mandate is, namely coordinating efforts of the United Nations development system and the United Nations system at large to promote the integrated implementation of the SDGs. Well, actually, the literature says there are many efforts to identify and discuss interlinkages. But then again, there's also not many tangible outputs to achieve this policy coherence. So good analysis of interlinkages, not so many policy answers to actually then go for this integrated approach. And what is notable that there's very weak engagement with the human rights, peace and security, and other economic and financial processes. And that is also because of the highly politicized nature. In terms of the global partnership and means of implementation, the mandate of the HLPF is to annually review SDG 17, which deals with the global partnerships and means of implementation, also following up the outcomes of the Forum for Financing Development and the Science, Technology and Innovation Forum. And these reviews then shall also offer a platform for multi-stakeholder partnerships. And again, in the literature, there were many expectations that this would be better than what the MDGs had delivered, MDG 8 had delivered in terms of the global partnerships, and also that it would be better than, say, what the Johannesburg conference has been doing in terms of multi-stakeholder partnerships. But the literature is also very clear that there's a lot of contestation around this, specifically what the global partnership implies. We'll hear more about that later. So the actual steering effects are a bit mixed too. There is in the annual HLPF meeting a session on SDG 17, but it is very disjointed, unclear what the added value is. The national reporting on financial issues is also very weak, and there's also no strong meta governance for these new type of partnerships for implementing the SDGs. It is basically because it's all a bottom-up approach, not steering, but really rather a bottom-up approach. So in terms of institutional changes, we see institutional changes. The HLPF, the creation of the HLPF and its use for the SDGs is in itself an institutional change. It has convening power. It is a platform for peer learning and for the review functions. It is a true focal point for the UN's work on the SDGs. And we see many discursive changes. For example, principles such as coherence and leaving no one behind are very well established. But in terms of normative changes, that is policy output, legislative initiatives, something like this, it's rather weak, as the UN is in general. It's mainly informal leadership. There is some role in pushing for enhancing coherence, but the actual impacts are very unclear. And with this, I give it to Stephen for the next sections.
Okay, thank you very much, Marianne. I'm going to speak about the UN development system and global environmental governance, and I'm going to keep it at a fairly high level so we have lots of time for question and answer, and we have the rest of our team here as well to elaborate on particular points that I might skim over fairly quickly. Marianne is in control of the slides, so great. You're going to keep up with me, and as I say, I'll go fairly quickly. So first, let me start off with the United Nations Development System and just start off with one of the sort of overall findings, which I think is typical of what we're seeing. Certainly in the two areas that I'm going to talk about. So that is that responding to the 2030 agenda was a major driver of reforms of the UN development system that have occurred since the negotiations and the acceptance of the SDGs. So there are clear efforts to align the system to the new agenda, and that's evident in many areas. However, the literature also notes that several of the reform efforts were attempts to respond to existing concerns or grievances. So it goes to this general point that it's hard to link specific reforms to the SDGs in particular, but the SDGs are also a result in part of pressures on the system that occurred before. And so you could say that they are at least a catalyst, but attributing causal effects to the SDGs and 2030 agendas is a little bit trickier. In terms of some specific findings in the literature, the 2016 Quadrennial Comprehensive Policy Review, the QCPR, resolution establishes the 2030 agenda as the overall objective. This is, for those of you who aren't familiar, this is a bit of sort of UN jargon, but it's actually a very, very important document because it outlines it gives direction and guidance to UN operational activities. So within the system, the QCPR has a lot of impact, so that's significant. At the country level, the SDGs are being used as a global results framework. So again, this goes to the discursive change and the ways in which policies are understood and evaluated. There is also a commitment across the system in strategic plans, at least in principle. So principles such as leave no one behind and national ownership have permeated through the system, though the scope of the changes vary across particular UN entities. Where there is a bit of a lack of analysis is how these efforts translate the goals into action on the ground. And you will see that this is a theme that comes through in our entire review of this area. Next slide. So in terms of improving system-wide coherence, the role of residence coordinators, which are very important players in terms of coordinating how UN activities are delivered at the country level, has been enhanced. And they report directly to the Secretary General. So this is de-linked from the sort of lead agency of the UNDP. The UNDP is obviously still very important, but the idea here is to align overall delivery of coordination and assistance with the SDGs, and to really overcome some of the divisions between programs and activities that was occurring on the ground. And again, this is part of a much longer process, but basically to break down the silos between peace and security, humanitarian aid, human rights, and sustainable development. Just as an aside, we didn't really find much on this in our current literature review, but there are discussions as well in terms of linkages to regional commissions. And I think that's a current topic of reform efforts. Maybe others might speak about that. Second, there is a new narrative that does seem to have permeated the system. So some of it is rhetorical, but rhetorical in an important way. So for example, the UN Development Assistance Framework has been renamed the UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework, and provides new guidance for a more integrated approach. The literature does, however, identify several obstacles to building coherence. It notes that the UN system still is fragmented, somewhat siloed. It remains difficult to overcome the fragmented nature of the system, in part because different parts of the UN, different agencies, and those that are affiliated with the UN have their own governing structures. Also, much literature spoke about still the dominance of earmarked funds, among other funding patterns that make it difficult to have more of an integrated approach. Next slide. Next, thank you. In terms of means of implementation of follow-up and review, the literature notes that there has been a shift from a focus on funding, sort of direct funding, to providing support and being a catalyst for mobilization of finance from multiple sources. So again, this is part of a broader trend in development. So the mobilization of private sources of finance, domestic, mobilizing of domestic resources, remittances, philanthropy, and other partners. But this is being framed in terms of mobilizing finance for the SDGs. There's also a debate over the partnership framing in terms of SDG, in terms of the implementation SDG 17. And that is that this idea of partnership sort of combines a maybe more traditional view about the responsibilities of donors and recipients and structural reform, which has been pushed more generally by the Global South, by developing countries, versus a broadening set of the idea of partnership as broadening the set of actors, and this idea of partnerships for sustainable development, and who might be involved in development finance and in terms of implementation on the ground. The literature does note that there are a variety of new activities related to implementation, but there is limits in terms of the assessments of the impacts of those initiatives. So the literature that we've seen tends to showcase different initiatives, but again, we're still looking for more literature in terms of what the impacts are on the ground. In terms of follow-up and review, there are various UN efforts to harmonize and establish global data standards related to the SDG indicators. So again, we see many initiatives in this direction, and this is one of the areas that it is easier to see the concrete results in terms of the data that's being collected. There are some general weaknesses in the literature, and some I've already mentioned, so I'm just going to go over them very quickly. There is a lack of causal analysis that linked the reform efforts to mobilization of knowledge and institutional design. So we're seeing these reform efforts, but again, it's hard to know from the literature the causal connections between the SDGs or Agenda 2030 and these reforms or specific commitments to the SDGs. There's also a lack of assessment of specific tools or instruments for implementation. So just to take one example, the Mainstreaming Acceleration and Policy Support Framework, which was adopted in 2016. So this is a framework that guides technical assistance and so on, but it's a little harder to see the effects. We've seen there are some limits in terms of the scale of financing that's needed, and it's concerned with the lack of assigning of specific responsibilities to implement goals. Okay, next slide. And I just got a note that I should speed it along, so I'm going to go very quickly through the next couple of slides. So Marianne, thank you. In terms of the overall, global environmental governance, the lead institutions remain UNEP and the newer United Nations Environment Assembly. Because of the fragmented nature of environmental governance, we see this play out with the SDGs as well. There's a lack of hierarchy. Different agreements have their own governing structures and so on. So we do see a clear commitment to the SDGs and attempts to create linkages, but coherence has been a challenge. So we see commitment to things like, for example, the Nexus approach, which is very much an approach that takes integration and coherence quite seriously. But the assessment so far of whether or not this Nexus approach has an impact suggests that its impact has been limited. Next slide. In terms of follow-up and review, the UNEP is custodian for 26 environment-related SDGs that aren't attached to a particular multilateral environmental agreement. So there are new efforts in terms of measuring indicators and feeding directly into the evaluation of the SDGs and various attempts to create standardization. However, in the environment area, the assessments note that data remains, the environment is the weakest area of monitoring of the SDG indicators, with only about 40% of country level data coverage for the 93 environment related indicators. So there's still lots more work to be done there. Next slide. And the overall findings, so this is really for everything in general of the three different areas. So the SDGs, as Marianne noted, have kickstarted, or they pushed sort of pre-existing alignment processes. So they are having effects, definitely having those discursive effects and those institutional effects. We've seen the creation of new institutions. We've seen normative references. So in policy, we see the discourse being played out, but there's lack of evidence how this is translated into the practice of global governance. And it's hard to say there's been a transformative impact, but at the same time, we recognize that there's a broader context here of, some would call it a crisis of multilateralism, or at least pressures on multilateralism. So given that, it's hard to be too critical, in the sense that even within that context, we are seeing the SDGs work their way through the system in terms of general guidance and discourse and attempts at policy. But again, we're waiting for good measurable studies of those impacts. And the last slide is just noting areas for future research. And this is going to be quite obvious from what we've been saying in terms of the finding, that empirical studies of changes in practices are still needed. It's relatively early days, so we do expect those to start coming on stream soon. Theoretical work on the drivers of institutional change. Again, this has been a mantra that we've mentioned that we were looking for in literature and we just didn't see. And finally, we haven't seen very many studies on the steering effects of the SDGs on non-governmental actors and partnerships. And here it's clear that if you look at where implementation is supposed to be occurring, or look at where we understand a lot of the action to be, it is in these non-state, of course there's the country level, but these non-state, sub-state, private sector actors and so on. And there's a huge amount of activity, but it's very hard to know what the impacts of that activity are because those studies just haven't been done yet. Thanks very much. I know that was a little quick, but we're really looking forward to the comments from Javier and from the audience. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Stephen and Marianne, for this very comprehensive presentation. So if you have questions for Marianne and Stephen, you can just write them in the Q&A box, and we will address them after our next presentation. And I now hand over to Javier for a short discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And the first thing I should do is to thank the organizer for having me here, and congratulate Marianne and Stephen for the excellent work they have done. And having said that, I want to share with you some reactions to the chapter and to the findings that were just presented to us. One of the things the work clearly points out is that any governance scheme, call it a governing through goals, which is the 2030 agenda case, or any other, goes through two different moments. The first one is the, let's call it, kickoff moment. And I want to underline here the word moment. This is the moment in which commitments are created and accepted by countries and other stakeholders. The second moment is the playing the game. And in fact, it is not a moment, it's a process. That's the big difference between the two. The playing the game it's a process in which commitments should be translated into actions. The moment then set the stage, but the process provides it with a particular direction and sense. It is crystal clear from the work that Marianne and Stephen have done regarding the 2030 agenda that there is a commensurable gap between the two. Of course, what we can call an initial impulse, this kickoff moment, has been translated into governance changes, some of them mentioned in the work, such as the attraction gained by the HLPF. But I want to be transparent on my position on this issue. The HLPF never has a chance to be an authentic 2030 agenda implementation orchestrator. It is full of flaws in the fabric, or if you prefer, countries, with some remarkable exception, I should say, never even intended to provide the HLPF with the tool required to that end. However, we would not underrate possible far-reaching effects of the 2030 agenda in shaping global governance. It is undeniable that the agenda only includes aspirational norms. Still, it's equally true that the aspirational norms were seeds for transformational changes many times in international relations history. It could be appropriate to remind that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, just to take an example, born as a United Nations General Assembly resolution. That means a not binding document for member states. So world countries' aspirations do matter. In Marianne and Stephen's work, you refer to aspirations, but also to expectations raised by scholars and experts, governments, representatives, stakeholders, and other engaged groups. Aspiration, as I have said, matters. What about expectations? Let me say that expectations are a solid transformative force. If you expect something, you accommodate your own priorities, mindset, and the ways of doing things to the reality you are expecting. By doing this, expectations start to transform actions and then impact the reality as it is. Nevertheless, academia in broad terms is producing knowledge in an increasingly elitist way. Much of the current academic production is not understandable for non-academics. So academic expectations are change enablers, but not as strong as they could be. Suppose People do not worry and are not provided with a chance to understand complex phenomena as climate change, inequality, poverty, transition to a green economy, energy. In that case, governments have the option not to care about such issues too. On a different line, but linked to this, I was personally involved as part of a Cepei's lead group in the current effort to reform the UN development system. And I should say that strengthening the regional layer to align it to the 2030 agenda, it is critical. Any attempt to think the 2030 agenda steering effects on governance schemes would include relationships and interlinkages among the different management levels. And let me say that aspirations profoundly differ at the distinct levels, an issue that requires much more research. In this regard, as the work demonstrates, the 2030 agenda focus on coherence is critical. However, what we need to strengthen the 2030 agenda steering effects is not coherence, but collaboration. The reason is simple. Collaboration brings coherence, but coherence does not necessarily bring collaboration. And collaboration is closer to partnerships than coherence. Another issue to be considered is, do we have a global governance mechanism for sustainable development at all? And my answer is no. We have an international sustainable development governance structure in which non-state actors are the main defendants of global interest into a primary interstate governance logic. Putting it black over white, the global side of any debate is always weaker than the international side. And the lack of a global approach bubbles up in the NorthSouth Divide debate. I live in the South, and in fact, I live in the south of the South. If you come to my country and continue going to south, you will only meet penguins. And I can affirm that the North-South divide is now broader than even before, because now it includes a more extensive agenda of confronting issues, such as technology gaps, democracy vaccination gaps, taxation gaps, internet governance gaps, and I can continue. That is why it is a tremendous mistake, I should say, an unintentional lack of respect, to state that after the 2030 agenda, all countries should be considered development countries, as some world leaders have said. And respectfully, my main critique to the chapter that Marianne and Stephen have wrote is the vacuum of voices of the South. It is hard to state that, for example, it became less important in the overall mix of domestic and international, as well as public and private flows to fund the 2030 agenda implementation, without hearing the experience of the small island development states or the least developed countries, which depends on traditional official development aid due to its difficulties to attract foreign investment or looking for funding at the international capital markets. So to conclude, the impact of the 2030 agenda on global governance is undeniable. However, they cannot be far from the 2030 agenda authentic substance. If we ask the 2030 agenda for more, we will blame it on not doing what it cannot do, and that is not fair. It will be better and much more result-oriented to identify the reason behind its flaws and to work to make governance feel uncomfortable with the situation as it is. And stakeholders have an essential role to play here. Among them, academia is the best suited actor to generate and spread the required knowledge in that joint effort. Good communication strategies should accompany good research, and knowledge should be democratized in every possible way to fulfill academia's mission. The UN member states set the stage in 2015, but that was only a moment. Building sustainable governance aligned to that moment is an ongoing process. Regarding the excellent work made by Marianne and Stephen, it's even more evident to me than before that the 2030 Agenda provides us the tools to build improved sustainability development governance. But it is also clear that depends on us how to use them. So if you allow me, I have a couple of questions. In fact, I have two questions that I want to raise to the authors. Having written your book, I wonder what incentives could be created to move towards a more assertive global governance scheme. That's the first. And the second, do you consider that is it possible or even convenient to bring together the different governance mechanisms in place acting in SDGs related fields such as health, energy, migration, and so far and so on? Or it would be against the 2030 Agenda possibilities of real implementation? So thank you very much. It was a pleasure to read the chapter. It's a pleasure to be here. And I really want to continue hearing the author. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Javier. Just before we open the floor for questions, I would like to give Marianne and Stephen the opportunity to address the questions that were raised by Javier very briefly, if you can. Thank you.
I can try and start. Javier, thank you very much for your comments. I very much agree. And I think you gave the answer yourself in pointing out the politicized nature of the game, right? I mean, the UN and specifically the high-level political forum on sustainable development is a forum, and member states are the actors. Thanks for pointing this out and reminding us. I mean, the SDGs by themselves, they don't do anything. The forum doesn't do anything. It's really the member states that are the drivers, that need to be the drivers in the seat here. And you pointed out that in terms of engagement for global public goods, it's rather the NGOs that have that role, and member states have their sovereignty issues. They are very concerned about, how to preserve their sovereignty in exploiting resources and all this. So when you ask us for incentives for a more assertive scheme, it is difficult because it would mean to overcome these sovereignty issues. And you could say maybe, but we need more research on this. Sorry for this cheap answer, but this is really what we need. We need more research on, how to do this before the problem pressure really forces us to act differently, because then it might be too late because of all these tipping points and so on, the discussion. And you were saying collaboration leads to coherence. Well, then we need better incentives to make the UN system collaborate, to make investors collaborate. And the UN has been reaching out, really setting up initiatives, but it is, I'm repeating myself, it is all bottom up, because that's what the UN can do without having a consensus by all member states on these issues. They can only provide platforms and then invite others to join them in their efforts. So this is really a problem of the UN at large, I'd say. Stephen, I don't know if you want to add.
Well, I'm just conscious of the time. I think they're excellent. Thank you for the excellent remarks and the excellent questions. And I think these are, the questions you're asking go to the heart of struggles even long before the SDGs. I mean, creating incentives to implement these, broadly agreed on normative goals that the system may have, and so on. And collaboration. I guess I would just say that there are many platforms for collaboration already. So it's not, in my view, it's not so much a matter of creating new institutions. I think where I've seen it work best is when the collaborations are quite focused on specific goals and where interlinkages can be productive. And often that is driven by a particular need at a particular time, and then you hope that it has legs further on. So we're seeing now, in terms of the COVID crisis, for example, some of the discussions around responses that WHO has put forward, the recent panel report that came out, talk about need for collaboration with the World Bank, with sort of on the finance side, with vaccines and knowledge and so on. And if those moments can be taken advantage of to create those linkages, then perhaps it could work. But as you say, that also means something that has to occur at the regional level. It can't just all be from the top down. Anyway, that's a kind of high level answer, but I think those are good questions to be asking, and hopefully we'll see more work in trying to figure out how to move in that direction.
Okay, thanks to you both. So we will now open the floor to questions. Well, I will actually, select some of the questions myself for the panelists to address. So we have several questions actually on policy coherence and integration. So for instance, Irena is asking, how do you think governance structures for the SDGs can be made more conducive to implementation, especially related to interlinkages and policy coherence? And more importantly, what kind of research would be needed to support this in order to inform policymakers? Would one of you want to take this?
I'm actually going to suggest if one of our collaborators would like to, because I think those are good questions that drill down a little bit into the different areas, although Marianne might want to speak generally to that. So I don't know if Pam or you or others might have some responses related to the particular realms of governance or institutions that we've looked at.
I would like also to mention that there will be a specific webinar on this topic, on the topic of policy coherence and interlinkages and integration, happening most likely after the summer. So stay tuned.
I already put an answer in the chat. What I would like to see in terms of future research is more assessments, that is integrated assessments really of integrated policies. That is, these nexus packages, for example, do they deliver? The GSDR, the Global Sustainable Development Report, suggested to go for these integrated transformative pathways and using 4 levers in combination to really bring about the transformative change when implementing the SDGs. And now I think what we need is answers in terms of what policy packages are most likely to deliver, or looking backwards, where we already tried to do something like this, like in the water, energy, food security nexus packages. Did they deliver? If so, why and how? So analysis, how can we learn from this? This is the kind of research that I would like to see for this.
Thanks, Marianne. Great, so we have also a question, I would say, on the issue of cherry picking, but so I mean, do you think that the number and broad scope of the SDGs be a problem for the implementation of the 2030 agenda? For instance, Alexandre is telling us that international organizations can choose just some goals to focus on and not promote the policy coherence and integration needed for a comprehensive implementation of the agenda. So this is also related to the issue of interlinkages, coherence among international organizations.
Pam has been nodding, so maybe she wants to go.
I can say one thing, that this was actually, despite the fact that it's supposed to be an integrated agenda, it was designed this way. Could not accept, you could not have UNDP, for example, take the lead on all of the goals, no matter that it wanted to. But that different goals are for different international organizations and also for different ministries. Where you get into the coherence part of it is the recognition that implementing perhaps one target could also have residual benefits across different SDGs and different targets. And so there is a need both at the national level as well as the international level for greater coordination on that. So even though one, FAO may take the lead on some of the food security related questions, but that the relationship to land degradation, which is under the auspices of also the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, calls for more collaboration between that treaty and that organization. And similarly at the national level, where if you're looking at agriculture, you also have to look at climate change. You also have to look at science. You also have to look at food distribution, food waste, which brings in a whole bunch of different ministries and departments. And so the idea is that not everyone has to implement everything, but you have to play to the greatest strengths internationally and nationally and even locally, and then bring in some coherence and coordination at those different levels.
Okay, thanks so much, Pam, for your question. So there's I would like perhaps to take one other question before we wrap up this webinar. There's one question from, I guess, one project that is being done at the University of Vienna in Austria. Would you have some insights on how the SDGs could be linked in more explicit ways to the issue of biodiversity? And perhaps it's more like a comment than a question. And this person shares his impression from Austria is that the actors have just started to get together to address biodiversity systematically at the national level and increase processes that feed into CBD. And so the SDGs actually add another layer, and it seems hard for some communities to relate to them beyond just mentioning that their work is relevant to specific SDGs. So would one of you have something to say about this? Javier, did you raise your hand?
Yes, but just a very short comment on that.
Yeah.
Just to say that it have no sense to think about the 2030 agenda and the SDGs without the framework of biodiversity. So it is not about linkages, it's about framing. And the 2030 agenda, it is only achievable if we considering biodiversity as a cross-cutting issue across not only the SDGs, but across all the agenda, including their principles, their means of implementation, the follow-up and review system. So it's part of the very core of the 2030 agenda. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. So I think that it is now time for me to close this webinar. So let me just share my screen again. So that you can have all information about our next event. But I would like really to warmly thank our panelists for such insightful presentation, and also our actively engaged audience for your question, and our technical facilitator, Leonie Kropp, for making this all possible. So next month, We will reconvene for an episode on the implementation of the SDGs at multiple levels with Rob Raven from Monash University and also Yixun Sun from the University of Bath, respectively lead and contributing authors of the third chapter of the SDG Midterm Impact Assessment. So just save the date in your agendas. It will happen on 29 June 2021. And this time the event will be moderated by my dear colleague, Thomas Hickman. And in the meantime, to stay up to date with our publications, events, and other activities, we invite you to follow our Twitter accounts at GlobalGoals_ERC. And for those of you who have specifically enjoyed this webinar and would like to further engage in SDG research, we invite you to join the Earth System Governance Task Force on the Sustainable Development Goals. We have shared with you in the chat box the website of the task force, which includes all details about how to join. So be sure to check it out. And that's it for me. So many thanks, and till next time.